Hello there, Trailblazers. Thanks for stopping by. In this video, I'd like to pitch in my own 2 cents on XgoSolo's video where he claims that Ruan Mei isn't a dedicated break support. He talks about various aspects of her kit that don't seem suited to break, but in my opinion, I think mainly not suited to break DPSs more than anything. His argument is that Ruan Mei, despite being used on break teams as their best in-slot support, her kit on its creation was not made for them, and he seems to argue that she's a DoT support. After watching the video, I was left unconvinced by his arguments. I didn't know why at the time, but it was just a strong gut feeling. So after digging deeper, I think I have the answer and find that the video may just suffer from narrow-minded thinking. I want to be upfront and say I am on the side that Ruan Mei is a dedicated break support. However, defining her kit is more complex. Essentially, is Ruan Mei an all-purpose support because she has break mechanics, or did she need to be an all-purpose support in order to be the dedicated break harmony? I lean more towards the latter suggestion, but for the argument at hand, that distinction doesn't matter. Either way, she was made for break, specifically the break playstyle, as it's a hybrid damage platform. Ruan Mei correctly should be categorized as an all-purpose support because every archetype has access to her full kit and its benefits so long as you are playing on Element. Whereas Robin and Sparkle can only buff break units by raising their attack stat, and even then, that's not useful to you since you're supposed to build them up to that point yourself. Robin also needs follow-ups to be at her max power, and nobody has ever argued for DoT Sparkle. Solo's only argument against this is that he has no reason to believe HOYO would release one in the game with rampant power creep and known for being greedy with its units, and that if they were this generous, they'd have given Ruan Mei for free instead of Dr. Ratio. I think this is his weakest argument because it doesn't prove anything and requires multiple things to happen that don't have to. To break it down, 1. An all-purpose support isn't going to impact future sales that much or the balance when you have to build 2 teams full of multiple DPS units who are going to want different supports for different scenarios, especially when they shift the meta to favor other units. 2. An all-purpose and an all-powerful support are 2 different things. And 3. Gacha games are made for people with poor spending habits and waifu collectors. The reason why those 2 points are important: the only way Ruan Mei can really affect the balance of this game is if she's so strong you're never pressured to buy another character again. And 3, people care more about pulling for hot girls than meta, typically, so that's not really going to impact them too much. And as for the Dr. Ratio free versus Ruan Mei free point, I think it's just silly. It makes perfect sense for the gacha company to sell the Omni support. First of all, congratulations on winning Mobile Game of the Year, HOYO-verse.
Hello! I like money!
What inspired you to give a niche DPS unit away for free instead of the most valuable character in the game?
Money!
Now, before I get into my points, I want to define some terms. 1. I am going to assume that when Solo said on his creation, he meant how was intended to be used when she came out. 2. The term dedicated for harmony units means their max potential. So, to kick things off, I want to disprove Ruan Mei as an intended DoT support, and I can do that by just analyzing the 1.6 and 2.0 patches. Section 1. Patch 1.6. Alright guys, I have a very simple question for you. If Ruan Mei is supposed to be a DoT support, why wasn't the Swarm weak to DoTs? Now, this goes far back to 1.3. When the Swarm disaster came out, the juvenile stings were weak to Quantum and Imaginary, and their propagation mechanic could only be halted by breaking, something DoT DPSs can't do to them. So then, why are they the main enemy of patch 1.6? I think this is extremely important because it reveals the direction of Ruan Mei very early. If DoTs halted their mechanic, then this would show intentionality. Instead, this only points to breaking. Now, there are the lesser stings that are physical, fire, and imaginary weak, so that means Gunaifin and Luca can break them. However, 1 out of 5 enemies does not a DoT focus make. Those elements, interestingly enough, also line up with Boot Hill, Firefly, and Rappa. And to expand on that further, do you guys realize that in patch 1.6, there is not one enemy that is weak to lightning or wind damage? That means for all of patch 1.6, Kafka, who is your only limited 5-star DoT DPS at this point, is completely unable to reduce the toughness of a single enemy that is relevant to this update. Same with Sampo. So you mean to tell me that Ruan Mei is a DoT support, and Solo expects you to believe her break mechanics were made for them when on her release, they couldn't actually use them? That alone would suggest that Ruan Mei's break mechanics were not made for DoTs, and all they really care about is the damage percent increases. Even worse, Kafka and Sampo are technically being excluded from the alt-type res pen. For those of you who are not aware, when an enemy is not weak to your element, they resist at least 20% of your overall damage. This means your Kafka is really only getting about a 5% damage increase from the damage she should already be doing. Meanwhile, Sampo is completely screwed because the juvenile stings, the most prominent ones, have a 40% wind weakness value, meaning all-type respen doesn't even overcome it. Why would HOYO-verse handicap DoTs this much against the basic enemies designed for Ruan Mei's release if they are her preferred teammates? And for any of you who want to talk about Luca saying he has a DoT, look, that's true, but he also plays like a hunt character more than anything, which for this patch carries its own set of issues. First off, I want to say the only reason that Nostings are weak to physical is because Argenti came the last patch and in his quest showed he had his own counter to them, equally doing damage to all of them at the same time to counteract their propagation mechanic. They made a patch where Argenti was shown to counter the bugs, and then they released another patch where you fight bugs that just so happen to be weak to him. And nothing shows this off more than the Scar Kabaz fight where these exact same problems exist. Again, your only real DoT option is Luca, and sadly, he is single target in a 5 enemy scenario where the boss will immobilize your units and mobs will focus them down. Meaning, you better break Scar Kabaz or the bugs to stop this. And sadly, I don't think Luca's gonna get that job done. In this fight, Luca is going to be repping as a hunt character more than he is the DoT playstyle. Even the MOC does this. Quick question, what floor was Svarog on? Floor 12, right? Wrong. He was on floor 8. Meanwhile, your final enemies were a true sting with no DoT weaknesses and Kafka, who, by the way, counters your Kafka by having no lightning weakness and a whopping 40% lightning res value. And even then, that point doesn't really matter, because we all know Ruan Mei was supposed to be used on the Sting regardless. You know, the one with no DoT weaknesses. But, you know what really sucks? If you didn't have Sampo or Luca before this point, they weren't on any banner that'll let you build them up to beat Kafka. Which also means anybody who joined on this banner didn't get a DoT DPS to go with their quote-unquote DoT support. This was quite literally a break patch that told DoTs they can't break. So I have a question for the audience. Why would HOYO-verse handicap a DoT support on her release and then teach you to use her wrong?
Sit down!
I must apologize for Wimp Lo. He is an idiot. We have purposely trained him wrong, as a joke.
You know, you could almost say that despite being used on DoT teams as one of their best in-slot supports, Ruan Mei, on her creation, was not made for them. 2.0 does fix the off-element issue with the Chef Dinosaur and the Something Unto Death meme, but there's another problem cropping up here. Ruan Mei has negative to 0 synergy with these DoT-based enemies. For the Dino, you want to stack DoTs on it as instances of damage build up its self-destruction timer. But breaking it will reset the mechanic entirely, meaning Ruan Mei encourages you to interact with and take advantage of this mechanic less by nature of her very design. And then with the Something Unto Death meme, breaking its soul cages won't release allies, meaning Ruan Mei is only supplying damage and a phase of reprieve to heal. In both instances, you can just run Gwenifin or Asta and actually play the encounter as intended. That is HOYO making deliberate DoT content Ruan Mei's break mechanics don't do anything for. That is direct evidence that she doesn't elevate the playstyle. From the DoT mains I've asked, the real X factor of DoT teams has always been Black Swan thanks to her reaching true damage. Section 2. Flawed Logic and Confirmation Bias. Alright, so that's two major issues for Ruan Mei as a DoT support. Her debut patch introduced break-based enemies that half of the DoT units and both DoT 5 stars can't break. Meanwhile, in the actual DoT patch, both DoT enemies do not give a special advantage to DoT teams when they are broken. So, as far as we can tell, HOYO has made zero effort to teach you or suggest to you that Ruan Mei is a DoT support, and I have a few other small details to cover that. By not providing a single DoT DPS unit to run alongside Ruan Mei in the 4-star category, HOYOverse has failed to make the simplest association with that damage archetype. Some of you might argue, well, Kafka was there on rerun. Yeah, but she was probably there because of Black Swan more than anything. And I seriously hope none of you are so bad faith as to say Pitch Dark Hook the Great is a DoT unit. She's a fantastic character, but let's attempt to be honest at the very least. Then there's Shui, who I will cover more in depth in a bit, but isn't it funny how this obviously break-oriented DPS unit is an element that can't deal damage over time, meaning she has no synergy with DoTs at all? To me, that kinda suggests that break isn't really the realm of DoT teams, especially when her sister Hanya is physical, which would count as a DoT on a break. But if those two traded elements, it would create much larger issues that I will go into shortly. Ruan Mei's break mechanics don't really increase DoT damage, nor does it really buff their playstyle. From what I can tell, all you really get is a few turns of reprieve and a 10% damage buff due to the weakness bar being gone. Solo argues that DoTs will perform better without a toughness bar, but that's literally how all damage in the game works. And he also says the flower has more use for DoTs than people realized, but if you recall my arguments, it's the fault of HOYOverse for making it so that you couldn't use it in any relevant content. And then in the patch where you could use Ruan Mei's break mechanics, they either A, negate DoT gameplay, or B, do absolutely nothing that she doesn't do for every other archetype in the game. In fact, I would say the synergy he points out is an illusion. All non-break units deal the lion's share of their damage to enemies with a toughness bar. Their damage is designed to work while the enemy can still fight back. That's why they only get a 10% damage buff. Whereas break teams and units have the 80% of their damage profile unlocked. Looking at you, Boot Hill. Oh, and we can't forget our golden girl herself, Firefly, and the dazzling ninja herself, Rappa. Meanwhile, Ruan Mei has her performance matched by Robin and Zhao Che. And I do mean matched, not exceeded by. Robin is about 2 or 3% better, making her the best in slot for DoTs, while Zhao Che is 3% worse than Ruan Mei. But in practice, they all clear in the same amount of cycles. Meaning, Ruan Mei's break mechanics, the very ones Solo would argue was made for them, are pennies on the dollar compared to the 93% damage buff. Zhao Che, with one DoT, does 97% of Ruan Mei's job, meaning she likely only outscales him just from her buff being bigger. And with the margin only being 3%, that means she is suffering from diminishing returns. It's true what they say, the best support for a DoT is just another DoT. Understand that one DoT is matching the performance of weakness shred efficiency, multiple instances of break damage, the enemy being broken, and the enemy having to take DoTs multiple times before they recover. That is about 4 to 5 buffs that one DoT is doing 97% the job of. Even worse, Zhao Che reveals a second issue with Ruan Mei's break mechanics. Once again, it's those darn elements. If you play off element, her break mechanics stop working. Half of her kit literally turns off. Yeah, I know that's obvious, you should be playing on element anyway, but hear me out. Does Robin exclude follow-up teams from her kit if you do this? What about Sparkle when it comes to any crit character? What about any of the 4-star harmonies? And what about the non-break half of Ruan Mei's kit? Kinda makes you think, huh? Let this sink in. Ruan Mei's E2 is useless to DoT teams if you can't break the enemy. Yeah, have fun spending $200 on that and you can't use it whenever you want. So, in my opinion, I feel like some of Solo's points are the product of confirmation bias. As I stated before, Ruan Mei's break mechanics don't actually elevate the DoT playstyle, however Solo provided arguments to how they work for DoT. My counter to this is, the ability to work with versus intended to synergize are two different things. Off rip, there is not one buff Ruan Mei provides to DoT teams that she doesn't provide to crit hypercarries or follow-up units. And what he pointed out is an illusion. We only need to focus on the Thanatoplum Rebloom interaction. While yes, it may look like it benefits DoTs by making them take DoT damage at least twice in a row without toughness recovery, this is simply a forced interaction. Due to DoTs being backloaded on enemy turns, this quote-unquote synergy will always happen, meaning Robin and Sparkle could have this mechanic as well, and it'd still exist. So while it could serve as proof, by itself, it's actually useless for discerning intention. Everyone else can use this to the same degree, they are just front-loaded. But in truth, both DoTs and crit receive the exact same DPS loss. The dots that the enemy will take if the flower fails to delay are the same dots they would have taken if it did delay them. So in truth, you lost another Kafka dot proc and Black Swan stacking more Arcana, the same way Ratio lost a skill and Chalk or Agential lost another skill and ult. There really isn't a buff there or an actual playstyle elevation. This logic requires you to ignore the fact that it doesn't really do all that much for dots, despite the fact his argument is that it doesn't do much for Firefly. He uses the fact that it can work for a DoT team, but doesn't see if it provides much of a staggering difference, when again, he did this exact same logic for the break team. However, it's even more egregious because he only measures it based off Firefly, when the break meta isn't only about the limited 5-star. I call it confirmation bias because he has to actively be ignoring everything else that goes into the break playstyle. That, or he really just didn't stop to consider it all. Limited 5-stars are designed to be super busted when they first release, and then they lean on Eidolon's light cones and external support later, after the first 1 or 2 reruns. Meaning we need to see how Firefly aged post-break meta before being conclusive on this point. I mean, he says Firefly is commonly at 210 speed, but can we all stop for a second and recognize that she just gives herself 65 of that for free? Meaning, without a single relic, she's already at 169, then Speed Boots lets her hit 194, and then Kalpagni gets her to 200? She was designed to be top tier out of the box. She's an extremely pushed unit. I don't think this is a good metric. Yeah, it may not be useful for Firefly, but what about Boot Hill? Did you know that if you just have a speed boot and a 2-piece speed set, Ruan Mei will help Boot Hill reach the breakpoint for Talia's without a single speed sub? And then with Rappa having a whopping 96 speed, I don't think anybody who farms rugs for a living is going to scoff at just getting 10 for free. Now to be fair, Rappa wasn't out yet, so we shouldn't hold that against him. But Boot Hill was there, and he focused so hard on Firefly he didn't even stop to consider that. It might be due to the fact that he doesn't own him. Now to tackle his logic, his arguments as a whole don't hold up to scrutiny. I feel like using Firefly as the barometer is flawed, as harmonies are not only designed around the 5-stars or just one 5-star, nor the peak 5-star. They are designed around the entire archetype, but also providing a broad value outside of their niche. He argues that if you added a unit that has toughness reduction and gave break effect, you just wouldn't need Ruan Mei on the break team anymore, since you'd one-shot them anyway with super break. But this is just saying you can replace Ruan Mei with Ruan Mei. Now to be fair, he's saying that the rest of her buffs don't really matter here, but I still think it's poignant to realize this. He says all you need to make a dedicated break support is someone with more than 50% weakness efficiency, def shred, and actual break buffs.
Well, no shit.
Translation: you can make a dedicated break support by copy-pasting Ruan Mei's entire break kit and making it slightly stronger. Yeah, wouldn't that be the case for every single harmony in the game? It's almost like Ruan Mei did that to literally every 4-star. And then Robin did that to Ruan Mei, but for follow-up teams. And Sparkle did it to her for crit hypercarry, and Sparkle was being called the better Bronya, but everyone still knows Bronya was a hypercarry support. He points out that Ruan Mei's banners run close to DoT units, but on her release, she was surrounded by every single archetype in the game. Argenti, an AoE crit hypercarry. Silverwolf, a Nihility debuffer who also saw use as the original Quantum Breaker. Blade, a Blast hypercarry. Ratio, follow-up hypercarry. And Kafka, DoT hypercarry. Then, on her rerun, she had both break DPS units, Jade and Argenti again, with Fu Xuan. I feel like you can't just tunnel vision on only DoTs when her kit is objectively the most varied and works with every single one of those characters equally. He says Ruan Mei is the first example of them placing characters next to their best in-slot teams when it came to runs and reruns. He points to HOYO, but HOYO was quite literally the best in slot on basically every team. HOYO is a generalist sustainer, and you cannot name a single archetype that does not want a 40% attack increase. Gallagher and Ling Sha call themselves out as break buffers because they have abilities that directly buff that damage archetype. However, it's not like HOYO buffs DoTs, she buffs all attack. Seriously, think about it. Wouldn't HOYO be good on both Argenti and on Jingliu because both of those characters increase their own crit stats? Especially Argenti, who has a very fat ult and would love the energy regen. Doubly so with Argenti, because every single time you ult on a HOYO team, she will heal the lowest HP ally. That means that Argenti heals the team every single time he spams his ult. I also think it's foolhardy to say that Ruan Mei was the best in slot for DoTs, because by virtue of being the best Harmony in the game, she was the best in slot for literally every single team. So unless she had excluding buffs that pointed her towards DoTs, you can't really make that assumption. But worst of all, I feel like he's not stopping to view the full depth of what Ruan Mei does. Saying her damage percent doesn't work with break is wrong. It may not be useful to break DPS units or break damage, but that doesn't mean it doesn't serve a purpose in the break play style. Let me ask you all one simple question. What exactly does Hat Blazer do? Section 3. The break meta. If you answered, he turns the entire team into break DPS units, you would be correct. And with that fact, it lets us see why Ruan Mei needed to be all-purpose. If Hoyoverse intended to move forwards with the break meta, they needed a Harmony that would patch the inherent issue at its core. All of the damage calcs of non-break units are useless to super break damage, meaning their super break damage is hard capped. However, if you added a unit who buffed all damage calcs in the game without fail, while also pulling double duty and buffing super break damage, you'd solve the issue outright. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the kill shot. The maximum potential of Ruan Mei's kit actively requires you to run crit in your super break teams because all of your non-break DPS units, i.e. people not named Boothill, Firefly, or Rappa, still operate on elemental damage calcs. And if you're skeptical, I want to draw your attention to Misha's light cone, Indelible Promise. What are the two stats on it? Break effect and crit rate. Quite the interesting combination, no? But let's go a step further. Did any of you ever wonder why Misha's kit was so mishmashed? Would you believe me if I said it's because he's a crit break hybrid who brings Ruan Mei utility? Though, crit break hybrid, I wonder if anybody else fits that bill. Now, if you read Misha's kit, he buffs a good bit of his own CV. However, his signature just randomly has break effect. Why? Well, did you guys know he actually has the highest weakness shred from one attack in the entire game? The first hit of his ultimate deals 10 toughness reduction, while the following 9 all deal 5. This means his max value is 55. Boothill's is 50. To be clear, these are toughness units, which is just the max toughness reduction divided by 3. The real max value of this is 165 and 150. So with Ruan Mei, this means Misha's max value is 247.5 and Boothill's is 225. Now, Obviously, Boothill and Firefly outpace him due to frequency of attacks, but the main point is that this is proof of what Misha was. He converts all of that directly into super break damage. He does crit, and thanks to having freeze, he mimics Thanatoplum Rebloom. Remember guys, Ruan Mei is an ice character. If you look at what Thanatoplum Rebloom does and break it down, it's just her version of freeze. It skips a turn, but the next turn comes around faster. Misha is the perfect representation of the break meta. Crit break hybrid with delay mechanics. All you need is this LC and a break rope, and then Hat Blazer covers the rest. And that should reconcile another one of Solo's flawed break arguments, not having the resources for 2 optimized teams if you have 2 break DPS units. Now, I don't exactly know what his metric for an optimized team is, so I'm just going to assume having at least 3 out of the 4 units contribute to the gimmick. Well, he already assembled a pretty good Boothill team consisting of Gallagher, Bronya, and Ruan Mei, which I gotta say I feel kinda shoots his argument squarely in the foot, especially if he wasn't aware that Ruan Mei buffs break damage. But, for the Firefly team, Hat Blazer is mandatory, so all that's left is the 3rd slot. Pela has a spot as we learned from Firefly's aptitude showcase, but now you can slot Misha in as a 3rd DPS, which will free up Pela to be on the Boothill team replacing Bronya if you don't have her. You can also slot Silverwolf in for ΛΞΡΛ. From where I stand, that's going to be 2 optimized break teams. Alright, keeping up with the pace, we're going to move on to HOYO finally. For this section, we need to recognize what she is. She is not a break DPS unit, she is a crit break hybrid. But more than that, she's a hybrid of all the DPS types that were expanded upon in 2.0. This means she was designed to slot into every single playstyle the game has to offer, excluding damage over time. If we look at her kit in depth, we see that she is the most versatile and modular 4-star in the game. She wants to build a lot of break effect because she converts it into a 1-to-1 damage dealt personal buff, which will feed directly into her crit hyper carry stats. And she possesses a follow-up alongside a colorless breaking mechanic, which is a very important detail by the way, because it allows her to retain access to Ruan Mei's entire break kit even when playing off weakness, which is something damage over time cannot do. And so with this revelation, I think we all can see exactly why her quantum alignment was very crucial to making this setup work. It's because she's designed to be on Sparkle's team, as a sub DPS or a main DPS. Without that quantum element, she would not synergize as hard with Sparkle. Sparkle is a hypercarry support who also heavily favors you having quantum units on the team. Her Nocturne trace means HOYO gets a 30% attack increase just from existing on the field. As a sub DPS, alongside that 30% attack increase or 45 if you run Lynx or Fu Xuan, your HOYO will also have access to an 18% to 28% damage increase. Meanwhile, the main DPS can be whoever you want. Or if you want to run her as a main DPS, well now alongside those added buffs, she's also going to have plus 100% crit damage, depending on how you build your Sparkle. For Robin, her follow-up gains access to the extra 25% crit damage buff, but more importantly, if you manage HOYO stacks properly, you can follow up at least twice and enable around 5 to 6 instances of concerto damage within 2 turns. That means on the follow-up team, your HOYO can generate an additional 50k to 60k damage. And for Hat Blazer, the fact she wants to build a high break effect value naturally and with a very large toughness bar chunking ult, it means she's another candidate as a break DPS. And then with Ruan Mei, her entire kit will play into HOYO's strengths. Her speed and break effect buffs will lessen the relic requirements. Her large damage buffs increase her crit, but crucially, all-type Respen is one of the only 2 buffs in the game that increase break damage without directly stating it like Besotted does. And like I mentioned before, colorless breaking means she's never locked out from Ruan Mei's full kit. Now to tie it all together, let's talk about HOYO's best in slot relic sets. That being the 4-piece Quantum set and the Inert Salsato. Now, I don't need to go into why a Quantum character wants to wear the Quantum set, but the most important thing here is that ΛΞΡΛ is the second buff in the game that increases break damage without directly saying it. meaning the 4-piece quantum set is one of the only two that buffs both crit damage and break damage, perfect for a crit-break hybrid. Meanwhile, Inert Salsato is buffing the crit damage of her break-based attacks. With her follow-up and her ultimate both possessing colorless breaking, this once again shows the intended synergy of crit and break. Now for the real kicker, if you have Ruan Mei on your account, I would argue that you should only build her to have 150 break effect outside of combat. Shuiyi's most premium setup will have her being at least E4 with an S5 Indelible Promise and a break rope. These are important because the break rope, her natural break traces, and Indelible Promise allow her to reach 158 break effect without a single sub or a break relic set. And then her E4 will bump her up to 198. Ruan Mei, when she is wearing the Watchmaker's set, will give Shuiyi 50 break effect, which carries her over to 240, maxing her out for the main damage phase. If you run this setup, you do not have to have a single break sub on your Shuiyi, meaning you can focus everything else you have into speed and either crit rate or crit damage, which is greatly helped by the fact that Indelible Promise provides you with 30 crit rate upon throwing an ultimate, which lines up exactly with her E4. And don't worry about that 50 break effect that you're going to be losing, because both Sparkle and Robin and Hatblazer replace it. Sparkle will replace it with a 30 to 45% attack increase and around 100 plus crit damage, and the 18 to 28% damage increase. Robin will replace it with around 900 attack and a 45% crit damage increase. Meanwhile, Hatblazer can give you 3 times the break effect you sacrificed. Just take a second to comprehend just how many buffs your Shuiyi is able to stack onto herself thanks to her versatile kit. And I am extremely confident that this was HOYO-Verse's intention because Shuiyi was made available during every single Harmony's banners. She was on both Ruan Mei's debut and her rerun banner. She was on Robin's debut banner, and while she was not available on Sparkle's banner, that's when they gave us our first 4-star selector and Shuiyi was an option. Now, if you were to swap Shuiyi over to physical so she could provide that bleed dot, you completely lose her synergy with Sparkle. And you know this was intentional because Jade has the exact same spot. Jade only cares about 2 stats, crit and attack. Section 4. Firefly was changed, and proof Ruan Mei was supposed to be all-purpose. So, I do want to go more in depth on Firefly. Solo points out that she can't use Ruan Mei's E2 because it doesn't increase her attack, and this is what sent him down the road of thinking Ruan Mei is a DoT support. He believes this was a purposeful exclusion, but I disagree. I believe this was a consequence of HOYO turning Firefly into a dedicated super break DPS when originally she was going to be a crit break hybrid. Now, this is going to be pure speculation on my part, so feel free to disregard this part of the argument, but there are some patterns that I noticed that felt odd, and I want to point them out because they tell an interesting story. Who knows, I might qualify as a host for game theory with this one. So, there is one strange thing about Firefly's kit, her health drain. I think we can all agree that it is the most pointlessly tacked on attribute of any kit in the game. It literally doesn't do anything because Firefly just heals it back on her first turn anyway, so why is it even here? I believe it's because she was supposed to operate like Blade, and that's precisely why we got Flames Afar as a random LC. Blade doesn't get a lot of love, and yet he somehow gets a free light cone that really only he can use? Yeah, that's not likely. However, if you look at Firefly's health mechanics and look at the Break Menace hybrid status, it paints a different picture. She was supposed to spend her health to raise her damage scaling, and she healed it to compensate, likely meaning she had a health cycling aspect of her kit before the rework. I believe Flames Afar is the free-to-play version of her original cone. If my theory here is true, then that means Ruan Mei's E2 originally did work on Firefly because she would have also done crit damage, And this could have also been the same with Boot Hill, who randomly gives himself 30 over 150. However, Ruan Mei's E2 was already set and released, and seeing as they don't do reworks post-launch, they didn't go back and change it and just move forwards with what they set up. Ruan Mei's E2 is only supposed to buff damage done to broken enemies. That's why it doesn't raise stats, it only buffs the attack that you submitted to the damage equation. Ruan Mei buffs the math, not the units. And this is Warden from the future talking. This video took a lot longer to come out than I had intended, so now I have some more information. But if we look at Rappa's event light cone, wouldn't it look like a proper 5-star cone if you just put the routed mechanic on it? Just saying. Strange how this is the first ever event cone that's not an alternative for the featured 5-star. And for those of you who remember your first encounter with Sam fondly, he did have his own health drain mechanic in the boss fight, didn't he? Alright, so after seeing just how much of this I've recorded, I've decided to expedite the Scarcabaz boss fight portion of this video, because I think it's very straightforward. The spark notes of it is, this boss fight was designed to house both Argenti and Dr. Ratio at the exact same time, with Ruan Mei as the buffer. You're supposed to use Argenti because this is a 5 enemy encounter and Argenti is the only AoE physical character, meaning he's the only one who can attack all of them at the exact same time. Scarcabaz acts as an energy battery for Argenti due to the fact that he spawns bugs, a lot of bugs, especially against his will. There is also relevant break advantages in this fight that dots cannot use. For example, if you break Scarcabaz, he will explode and break all the bugs he spawned on the field. Also, if you manage to break the Nostings, they will not be able to attack in the focus down phase of the fight whenever one of your teammates is immobilized. Argenti and Ruan Mei put together can shut this entire boss fight down. Meanwhile, as for Dr. Ratio, he is imaginary, Scarcabaz is the only imaginary enemy on the field, Dr. Ratio is a hunt character, meaning single target. Thanatoplum Rebloom counts as a debuff. Whenever you break enemies, they're going to get an elemental break effect that also counts as a debuff. When any Nosting dies, they're going to spread and stack vulnerability onto the rest of the field. And Dr. Ratio's skill has a debuff on it. An enemy only needs to have 3 debuffs on them for Dr. Ratio to have a guaranteed chalk throw, meaning he already gets it without having to even use his own. And for the elephant in the room, that being the fact that Dr. Ratio wasn't out by the time this boss fight rolled around, you had plenty of time to realize this when you had to farm Scarcabaz for every single one of your characters in all of 2.0 until Boot Hill. This boss fight shows Ruan Mei's ability to buff crit hyper carries, follow-up DPSs, and enable break-style gameplay. She does all of that at the exact same time, so I don't know why it's so preposterous to think she is a all-purpose support.
Will be swept away.
And with that, I don't think there's much else I can really add here. I feel like I presented all the information that's needed to prove that Ruan Mei is in fact a dedicated break support, and we did it while also proving that she was all-purpose at the same time, meaning both of the assertions Solo made about her would be wrong. So, all that's left is to address this. He said we'd know he was correct after 4 months from his video posting. I don't think that will happen. HOYO-verse will actively have to release a Ruan Mei clone to do so, which I just don't see happening. No, in my humble opinion, I think Fugue is going to be the limited version of Hatblazer, because what we have to remember about Kalis and Stel, they have different forms, so in the future, if you need TB to be on a different path, you'll have an option to fill the hole, which just means Ruan Mei is swapping partners while maintaining her exact position. Solo said the Harmony characters tend to have utility outside of their specific niche, but are we really going to amount Ruan Mei essentially running the entire break playstyle as simple utility? Something funny that my DoT friend told me is that the only people who believe Ruan Mei is a DoT support are people who don't main dots. And after everything I've managed to cobble together from just analyzing the gameplay, I have to agree. In fact, I would say this. Dots may have needed Ruan Mei to have the level of performance they have now throughout 2.0, but she has never once needed them.
You need me, man, I don't need you. You need me, man, I don't need you. You need me, man, I don't need you at all. You need me, man, I don't need you. You need me, man, I don't need you. You need me, man, I don't need you. You need me, man, I don't need you at all. I sing.
All-purpose support, hybrid buffer, dedicated breaker. Ruan Mei fits the bill to be all three of those things at the exact same time. The reason why I believe it is appropriate to say Ruan Mei is a dedicated break support is because if you took away her damage percent increase, she would only have break mechanics left. As it turns out, HOYO-verse actually was generous enough to give you a support that would bring long-term value to your account because they made a playstyle that's designed to be hybrid and incorporate non-break DPSs into it. And thus, they gave you a unit that can buff non-break characters and break characters at the exact same time. What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. I find this to be a very fun conversation. Ladies and gentlemen, I have been Warden. This is going to be my first and hopefully not last time signing out. I appreciate you giving me your time if you made it to this point, and I want to wish you all the best of luck on your trailblazing expeditions. See you around.